Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her F-16 Fighting Falcon as the pre-dawn darkness stretched endlessly before her. The radio crackled with final mission briefings while her squadron of 12 aircraft prepared for what intelligence called a routine reconnaissance mission over hostile territory. Sarah had flown these missions dozens of times before, but something felt different today. The weight of responsibility pressed against her chest as she reviewed the formation protocols one final time. Her squadron leader's voice cut through the static, reminding everyone to maintain strict formation and radio silence once they crossed into enemy airspace. Sarah acknowledged the order with a crisp, "Copy that, Alpha Leader," while checking her instruments for the third time in 5 minutes. The mission seemed straightforward enough: fly in tight formation, gather intelligence on enemy positions, and return to base without engagement. Standard operating procedure demanded absolute adherence to formation flying, especially in contested airspace where a single aircraft braking pattern could compromise the entire mission. As the squadron lifted off into the gray morning sky, Sarah found herself positioned as the number 7 aircraft in the diamond formation. The landscape below transformed from friendly territory to neutral zones, then gradually into areas marked red on their tactical maps. Her radar screen remained clear, but the tension in the cockpit grew thicker with each passing mile. The mission briefing had emphasized the importance of maintaining formation integrity. Any deviation could trigger enemy radar systems and expose their position to surface-to-air missiles. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed unusual readings on her electronic warfare systems. Faint signatures appeared and disappeared on her scope, suggesting enemy aircraft might be operating in the area despite intelligence reports indicating clear skies. She wanted to report the anomalies but remembered the strict radio silence orders. Formation discipline meant trusting her squadron leader's judgment and following orders without question, even when her instincts suggested something was wrong. The landscape below showed increasing signs of military activity as they approached their primary target area. Sarah could see vehicle movements through her targeting pod, but more concerning were the intermittent radar pings that suggested enemy air defense systems were actively scanning for intruders. Her training kicked in as she focused on maintaining precise positioning relative to the aircraft ahead of her, even as every fiber of her being wanted to take evasive action. As they reached the halfway point of their mission, Sarah's radar warning receiver suddenly erupted with alarm tones. Multiple enemy aircraft signatures appeared simultaneously on her screen, approaching from the northeast at high speed. The squadron leader's voice finally broke radio silence with urgent commands to maintain formation and prepare for possible evasive maneuvers. Sarah's heart raced as she realized they had flown directly into what appeared to be a carefully planned ambush. The enemy fighters were closing fast, and Sarah could see on her tactical display that her squadron was outnumbered 2-1. Standard doctrine called for immediate defensive positioning, but the formation was flying too close together to execute proper combat maneuvers. She watched helplessly as the gap between friendly and enemy aircraft shrank on her radar screen, knowing that in less than 3 minutes, her squadron would be within missile range of a superior force that held every tactical advantage. The enemy fighters appeared as small dots on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. Sarah's squadron leader attempted to coordinate a defensive response, but the tight formation that had protected them during the ingress now became a liability. The aircraft were bunched too closely together to execute independent evasive maneuvers, and any attempt to break formation would leave individual pilots vulnerable to missile attacks. Sarah monitored her threat warning systems as multiple enemy radars locked onto their formation. The distinctive tone of missile guidance systems filled her headset, indicating that weapons had already been fired from beyond visual range. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but the reality of incoming missiles created an entirely different level of stress than any simulation could replicate. The squadron leader ordered immediate defensive maneuvers, but the formation's tight spacing made coordinated evasion nearly impossible. As the first wave of enemy missiles streaked toward their position, Sarah realized that her squadron was trapped in a tactical nightmare. They were too far from friendly territory to run, too closely grouped to fight effectively, and facing an enemy force that had clearly planned this engagement in advance. The mission that had begun as routine reconnaissance had transformed into a fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Sarah's aircraft shuddered as she deployed chaff and flares to confuse incoming missiles. Around her, Other squadron members executed similar defensive measures, filling the sky with metallic strips and bright decoys designed to draw missiles away from their targets. The enemy had timed their attack perfectly, catching the formation at maximum vulnerability during the most dangerous phase of their mission. Through her canopy, Sarah could see enemy fighters closing to visual range. The distinctive silhouettes of advanced fighter aircraft became clearly visible as they maneuvered for optimal attack positions. Her squadron was caught in a deadly trap, with enemy forces controlling both the timing and geography of the engagement. The radio filled with urgent communications as pilots called out missile launches and attempted to coordinate defensive responses. Sarah's threat warning receiver screamed, constantly now as multiple enemy aircraft maintained targeting locks on her squadron. She could see missiles in flight, bright streaks against the morning sky that represented immediate and deadly threats to her fellow pilots. The formation that had seemed so secure during peacetime training exercises now felt like a death trap as enemy fighters exploited every weakness. In their defensive positioning, the squadron leader's voice cut through the chaos with orders to break formation and engage. But by then, the enemy had achieved surprise and positional advantage. Sarah watched her tactical display with growing horror as she realized the enemy had planned this ambush with surgical precision. They had waited until the reconnaissance formation was at its most vulnerable point, deep in hostile territory and committed to a predictable flight path. Now her squadron faced the nightmare scenario that every fighter pilot dreaded, being outnumbered, outgunned, and caught completely off guard by a superior enemy force. The first missile impact lit up the morning sky as one of Sarah's squadron mates took a direct hit. She watched in horror as the aircraft exploded in a brilliant fireball, sending debris spinning through the air where moments before a fellow pilot had been fighting for survival. The radio erupted with urgent calls for the pilot to eject, but the silence that followed confirmed everyone's worst fears. The reality of combat had arrived with devastating suddenness. Sarah's squadron leader ordered an immediate break to combat spread formation, but the damage was already done. The enemy had achieved tactical surprise and was now pressing their advantage with ruthless efficiency. Sarah pulled her aircraft into a steep climbing turn, trying to gain altitude and separation from the killing field that their formation had become. Her radar warning receiver continued its urgent warnings as enemy fighters maneuvered to maintain targeting solutions on the scattered American aircraft. As she climbed, Sarah could see the entire tactical situation developing below her. Her squadron was scattered across several miles of airspace, with individual aircraft trying desperately to evade multiple enemy fighters. The coordinated reconnaissance mission had dissolved into a chaotic dogfight where survival depended on individual skill and luck, rather than tactical planning. Enemy fighters moved with practiced precision, suggesting this ambush had been carefully rehearsed. Sarah's fuel gauges showed she was burning through her reserves at an alarming rate due to the high-performance maneuvers required to stay alive. Combat flying demanded maximum throttle settings and constant direction changes that consumed fuel far faster than cruise flight. She realized that even if her squadron survived the immediate engagement, they might not have enough fuel to reach friendly territory. The enemy had trapped them in both tactical and logistical terms. Through her targeting system, Sarah could see enemy fighters coordinating their attacks with military precision. They were using classic fighter tactics, with some aircraft engaging directly, while others positioned themselves to cut off escape routes. The enemy pilots clearly understood they held every advantage in this engagement and were methodically working to eliminate each American aircraft. Their patience and discipline suggested extensive training and combat experience. Sarah's aircraft shook violently as an enemy missile passed close enough to trigger her defensive systems. The near miss reminded her that death was only seconds away, and that every decision could be her last. She watched her radar display and realized the enemy was systematically working to isolate individual aircraft from the scattered formation. Once separated, each pilot would face multiple enemies alone, making survival virtually impossible. The squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio with increasingly desperate attempts to coordinate a defensive response. But the formation had been shattered so completely that individual pilots were fighting their own battles for survival. Sarah could hear the strain in her commander's voice as he tried to maintain some semblance of tactical control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to manage. The mission had become every pilot's worst nightmare, a fight against impossible odds with no clear path to survival. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah made a decision that violated every protocol she had ever learned. Instead of following the squadron leader's orders to regroup with the remaining aircraft, she deliberately turned away from her squadron and flew directly toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters. Her actions appeared to be those of a pilot who had panicked under fire, abandoning her formation and flying straight into the enemy's strongest position. The squadron leader's voice filled her headset with urgent commands to return to formation, but Sarah maintained radio silence and continued her seemingly suicidal course. To outside observers, it appeared that the stress of combat had overwhelmed her judgment, causing her to make the exact mistake that enemy fighters were hoping to exploit. Her aircraft flew alone and apparently defenseless toward a cluster of 4 enemy fighters who immediately recognized the opportunity. Sarah's radar warning receiver screamed constantly as multiple enemy aircraft locked onto her isolated aircraft. She was now flying directly into what appeared to be certain death, with no support from her squadron and no apparent escape route. The enemy fighters began maneuvering to intercept her flight path, sensing an easy victory against a pilot who had clearly lost her tactical awareness under the pressure of combat. As enemy fighters converged on her position, Sarah activated every electronic warfare system on her aircraft. She deployed clouds of chaff and flares while simultaneously jamming enemy radar frequencies and broadcasting false targeting information. Her aircraft became a moving electronic warfare platform, creating a massive signature that attracted the attention of every enemy fighter in the area. To the enemy, she appeared to be a high-value target that required immediate destruction. The enemy took the bait completely. Aircraft that had been pursuing other squadron members broke off their attacks to converge on Sarah's position. Her deliberate violation of formation discipline had created exactly the distraction her squadron needed, drawing enemy fighters away from her scattered teammates and concentrating them against a single target. But now she faced the consequences of her decision as multiple enemy aircraft closed in from all directions. Sarah's aircraft became the focus of intense enemy attention as fighters closed in from multiple vectors. Missiles streaked through the air around her position as enemy pilots competed to claim credit for destroying what appeared to be an isolated and confused American pilot. She maintained her course toward the enemy concentration, using her electronic warfare systems to create maximum confusion and draw as many fighters as possible away from her squadron mates. The tactical situation had completely reversed from the original ambush. Instead of a coordinated enemy attack against a scattered American formation, the engagement had become a chaotic furball with most enemy fighters converging on a single target. Sarah's apparent loss of tactical discipline had created the exact situation her squadron needed to escape the trap, but she now found herself alone against overwhelming odds with little chance of survival. Her violation of orders had saved her squadron, but the cost would likely be her own life. With enemy fighters converging on her position from multiple directions, Sarah pushed her aircraft to its absolute performance limits. She pulled into a vertical climb that stressed her F-16 to the edge of its operational envelope, using the fighter's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude faster than the enemy aircraft could follow. The G-forces pressed her deep into her ejection seat as she climbed toward the thin air at maximum altitude. At 35,000 feet, Sarah rolled inverted and pulled her aircraft into a steep dive back toward the enemy formation. Her radar screen showed 6 enemy fighters climbing to intercept her, exactly as she had hoped. By drawing their attention upward, she had pulled them away from the low-altitude escape routes her squadron mates were using to flee toward friendly territory. The enemy had taken her bait and was now positioned exactly where she wanted them. Sarah's fuel situation had become critical due to the high-performance maneuvering required to stay ahead of enemy missiles. Her gauges showed barely enough fuel for a direct flight to friendly territory, with no reserve for additional combat maneuvering. She realized that her survival now depended on executing a perfect escape plan with no margin for error. Any mistake would leave her stranded in enemy territory with an empty fuel tank. As she dove toward the enemy formation, Sarah activated her targeting radar and locked onto the lead enemy fighter. The sudden appearance of targeting radar surprised the enemy pilots, who had expected to be hunting a defenseless aircraft. Instead, they found themselves facing an aggressive pilot who was apparently preparing to engage them in direct combat despite being outnumbered 6-1. The psychological effect of Sarah's aggressive maneuver was immediate and dramatic. Enemy fighters that had been closing confidently on what they thought was easy prey suddenly found themselves being targeted by an aircraft that showed no signs of panic or confusion. Sarah's radar lock forced the enemy formation to break apart as individual pilots took evasive action, destroying their coordinated attack plan. Sarah used the momentary confusion to execute a high-speed dash toward friendly territory. Her aircraft streaked across the sky at maximum throttle, staying low to avoid radar detection while burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. Behind her, enemy fighters attempted to reorganize their pursuit, but her aggressive targeting display had disrupted their formation and bought her precious seconds of escape time. The radio crackled with transmissions from her squadron mates who had successfully escaped the initial trap. Sarah could hear relief in their voices as they reported successful egress from the combat area, but she remained focused on her own desperate flight toward safety. Her fuel gauges continued their relentless countdown toward empty tanks and a forced landing in hostile territory. The success of her deception had saved her squadron, but her own survival remained far from certain as enemy fighters regrouped behind her and began a determined pursuit. Flying at maximum speed just above the terrain, Sarah's aircraft consumed fuel at an alarming rate as she raced toward the safety of friendly airspace. Her navigation system showed the border still 40 miles away, while her fuel gauges indicated she had perhaps 30 miles of flight time remaining at current consumption rates. The mathematics of survival were working against her as enemy fighters closed the distance behind her. Sarah's threat warning systems detected enemy radar attempts to lock onto her aircraft, but her low-altitude flight path and electronic countermeasures made targeting difficult for the pursuing fighters. She flew through valleys and around hills, using the terrain to mask her radar signature while maintaining maximum speed toward friendly territory. Every second of delay increased the risk that enemy fighters would achieve a successful missile lock. 20 miles from the border, Sarah's fuel flow indicators showed her tanks approaching empty. She reduced throttle slightly to conserve fuel, accepting the increased risk of enemy interception in exchange for a few more minutes of flight time. The pursuing fighters had closed to within visual range and were beginning to position themselves for missile shots despite the challenging low-altitude engagement geometry. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent transmissions from friendly air traffic controllers who had detected the incoming aircraft on their radar screens. She broke radio silence for the first time since beginning her deception, transmitting a brief emergency declaration that identified her as a friendly aircraft requesting immediate assistance. Her transmission triggered an immediate response from border air defense units, who began coordinating intercept vectors for friendly fighters. As Sarah crossed into friendly airspace, her fuel gauges showed virtually empty tanks. Her engines began experiencing fuel flow interruptions that caused temporary power losses and threatened complete engine failure. She could see a friendly airbase ahead, but her fuel situation had become so critical that reaching the runway was no longer guaranteed. Enemy fighters had broken off their pursuit at the border. Unwilling to risk engagement with friendly air defenses, Sarah declared a fuel emergency and requested immediate landing clearance at the nearest airbase. Air traffic controllers cleared all other aircraft from the approach pattern and activated emergency response teams as her F-16 began its final approach with engines running on fuel vapors. Her airspeed decayed rapidly as fuel flow became intermittent, forcing her to accept a steeper than normal approach angle. The landing was successful, but barely so. Sarah's engines flamed out just as her aircraft touched down on the runway, leaving her to coast to a stop using only momentum and wheel brakes. Emergency crews surrounded her aircraft as she climbed from the cockpit, physically and emotionally drained from the most intense combat experience of her career. Her violation of formation orders had saved 11 pilots and their aircraft, but the cost had been measured in minutes of flight time and seconds of fuel remaining. She had gambled everything on a desperate plan that succeeded by the narrowest possible margin. The debriefing session took place 12 hours after Sarah's aircraft had coasted to a stop with empty fuel tanks. Intelligence officers, squadron commanders, and tactical analysts filled the secure briefing room as they attempted to understand how a routine reconnaissance mission had nearly resulted in the loss of an entire squadron. Sarah sat at the head of the conference table, still processing the events that had transformed her from a disciplined formation pilot into the architect of her squadrons. Survival initial criticism focused on Sarah's apparent violation of direct orders to maintain Formation discipline. Several senior officers questioned her decision to break away from the squadron and fly alone toward the enemy concentration. From their perspective, her actions represented a dangerous breach of military protocol that could have compromised the entire mission. The discussion grew heated as different viewpoints emerged about the appropriate response to unexpected combat situations. Sarah's squadron leader provided crucial testimony that shifted the tone of the investigation. He explained how the enemy ambush had trapped the formation in an impossible tactical situation, with no viable options for coordinated escape or effective defense. He described watching helplessly as enemy fighters systematically positioned themselves to destroy each aircraft individually, until Sarah's unexpected maneuver drew their attention away from the scattered formation. Combat camera footage and radar recordings confirmed that Sarah's actions had indeed saved the squadron. The electronic records showed enemy fighters abandoning their pursuit of other aircraft to converge on her position, creating the distraction that allowed her squadron mates to escape the trap. Intelligence analysts determined that without her intervention, the enemy's coordinated attack plan would likely have succeeded in destroying most or all of the American aircraft. The investigation revealed that enemy forces had been monitoring American reconnaissance patterns for weeks, waiting for the optimal opportunity to execute their ambush. They had chosen the engagement location and timing with precision, catching the formation at maximum vulnerability deep in hostile territory. Sarah's violation of formation protocol had disrupted their carefully planned attack sequence and prevented what could have been a devastating loss of aircraft and pilots. Military prosecutors ultimately decided that Sarah's actions, while technically a violation of direct orders, had been justified by the extreme circumstances of the engagement. Her decision to act as a decoy had demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness and personal courage under fire. Instead of facing disciplinary action, she was recommended for commendation for her innovative response to an impossible combat situation. The incident became a case study in military academies and flight training programs, illustrating how rigid adherence to protocol can sometimes conflict with survival in actual combat. Sarah's experience demonstrated that effective military leadership sometimes requires the courage to make difficult decisions that violate standard procedures when circumstances demand innovative solutions. Her violation of formation orders had indeed saved 11 pilots and their aircraft, proving that the best military decisions are sometimes those that break the rules when following them would lead to disaster. The mission that began with orders to maintain formation ended with Sarah's calculated decision to become the decoy that saved them all.